Truth does not offer you a path that is frictionless and smooth and free of blemishes. Truth asks that you are willing to lose everything to get closer to her, to have the courage to be demolished in her honor by opening up wider and wider to a staggering, awesome, complicated, heartbreaking, brilliant life, to bear witness to what is joyful and also to what is painful with the same curiosity, respect, and love. Because we live in a world of darkness and light, and they are equally our teachers. Welcome to Voice of the Mountains and the first episode of our second season. Today's conversation cues up some new themes for this season, perhaps the most obvious being that we will be borrowing our guest's perspective to examine the quixotic art of becoming from the outside looking in. Our first guest has helped us all think more deeply about what drives us forward. He has lived a life that remained open to choosing the harder path. He has asked himself why our achievements do not resolve our inner restlessness, and he has discovered for himself that the finish line, more often than not, is the starting line for a new kind of journey. I invite you into a new season, and I invite you to contemplate the tension that exists between mastery and exploration, to examine the paradox of effort, and to think about what it truly means to seek meaning in toil and struggle and reflection. Let's begin. So, Alex, thank you for being on the podcast. It's really great to have you.
Thanks, Steve. It's awesome to be here.
So, our listeners are going to know you from your work at the New York Times, from Outside Magazine, and of course, your book Endure, which many uphill athletes are fans of and have shared with me personally. I heard you talking about how you felt like you had sort of reached a professional peak with Endure in another interview, and that you felt sort of restless and maybe not completely settled somehow with that. And how did that play out for you? How did that come up? How did you recognize that feeling? And then where did that lead you?
Yeah, I mean, Endure, not to break my arm patting myself on the back, but Endure was I was really proud of that book, and it was the culmination of probably a decade's worth of pretty focused reporting in one specific area, and it resonated. Like a lot of people read it, and I heard a lot of people said nice things, and all in all, I guess what I'm saying is, if I had written on a cocktail napkin in 2004, I guess it was, when I decided to go to journalism school, if I like, what would be amazing, what would fulfill your dreams in this career, like Endure was pretty much it. I'd had a chance to spend years covering a sport that I'm really passionate about, running, and to talk to scientists, and so talking to people that I found interesting, and engaging in a conversation with a broad audience, not just with my buddies on the long run. Mm-hmm. So, all the different, and it sold a lot of copies too. So all the different sort of modes of external gratification were being scratched for me. And I shouldn't have been surprised, but because you kind of think, oh, well, then life will be complete, and I'll just settle back on the sofa, and there'll be nothing more I want. But if there's one thing I should have learned from running, it's that achieving one goal gives birth to the next goal. And in running, it's very obvious what the next goal is. If you run a certain time, you want to run faster than that time. In journalism, it's less clear. And so Endure came out in 2018, and I sort of was busy with Endure that year. But by 2019, I realized that I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do next, but I had the feeling that it wasn't just kind of doubling down. It wasn't writing Endure 2. And I was really actually a little bit struggling to figure out what it was I did want to do, or what would make me happy or fulfilled or and so on.
I can imagine there was a lot of external pressure from probably publishers and others who were like, hey, it's all teed up for you. Do Endure 2. It'll be easy. It's going to be popular. There's more to say on the topic. you could probably write an outline in your head in 30 minutes or less. Uh, but you didn't do that. How did that play out?
Yeah. I mean, and I would say as much as there's perceived external pressure, a lot of it was also internal pressure. Like I'm a strategic guy.
Yeah.
I like making a living.
Yeah.
And so I was aware of the realities of the situation and really, I'm also, I would say if you look back over the course of my life, I've been pretty good at following the prescribed path. Well, if you're good at science in high school, you go do a science degree in university, and if you're good at physics in university, you go do a PhD, and sort of following quote unquote the next logical step.
Yeah.
And there've been a few times where I've deviated from that, and the biggest one was I was a physics researcher in my late 20s when I was like, actually, and the next step is to start looking for a professorship or whatever.
Yeah.
And I thought, actually, this isn't what I want to do. I want to be a journalist. And so
Okay.
I'd taken that big leap at that point. That would have been 2004 when I was 28. And so this felt like another one of those moments where the ruminations or the signs in my head were that actually, Alex, this is a time not to just keep doing the thing that's expected. And I guess one thing I'll say is I had role models that in this, and on the one hand, within my family, my dad was an engineer, an oil field engineer, until he was 28. And then he went back and decided to go to theological college at that point. And my older brother was doing a PhD in math until he was 28. And then he decided he actually wanted to be an archivist, and he went to library school. So I've seen people take these left turns, and even with my own field, someone who I really, really look up to is David Epstein, who had written The Sports Gene in 2013, which really set him up to be the sort of sports science guy. He was at Sports Illustrated at the time, and it was Sports Gene was a fantastic book and fantastically successful. And he left Sports Illustrated and went to ProPublica to do investigative environmental reporting. And then he ended up writing a very different book called Range. And so I had conversations with David about his thinking, but he really, his example sort of helped me to believe that, okay, you don't have to do what's most lucrative or will be most materially obvious. You could do other things, and it's not totally irrational to think about what would be fulfilling.
So you have these role models, let's say, and I mean Epstein's an amazing writer. I loved both of his books for different reasons, but just like I love both of your books for different reasons or on different topics. But what do you think, having written this book about exploration, what do you think is fueling this kind of urge to take left turns, as you put it? Where does that come from? Where does that, and I mean, you wrote a lot about this in the book, but I'm very curious because it seems to have affected you very personally, and what the intersection between your personal journey with this and what you observed in the scientific literature and talking to all these experts in penning, many chapters. Where was that intersection, and how do you, or did it feel, were they divorced, these two areas for you?
No, there was very much a sort of meta kind of chasing the tail of the dragon element, where I started writing the book to find out why I wanted to write the book. Once I got into the book, it became its own topic, and in a sense that sort of faded away. I knew, like, this is the book I wanted to write, and so there was no longer this, like, I could almost no longer even remember why I was confused about what I wanted to write. Like, this is perfect for me. But starting out, I was like, I know I want to write something different, but I don't really know why and how this connects to all the other times in my life where I've felt like didn't want to just stick with the same old, that I was attracted to novelty almost for the sake of novelty. And so, yeah, there's definitely this element where I was trying to write it. And in fact, in the initial draft of the book, in the introduction, I have a sort of I had a very long section where I was sort of like Hamlet, kind of soliloquizing about, do I dare to write another book about, endurance? What should I, to write or not to write? And my editor was like, look, I get it. You can put a paragraph in there, but no one wants to start a book, open a book and be like, I don't know what I want to write a book about. Like, you want to feel like the author knows what he's talking about. So anyway, all of which is to say, it was very personal. And in terms of the answer, in terms of like where this urge to do something different comes from, there was no like simple pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. There's like, oh, now I understand everything about my inner workings and life is simple. But I did come away with the feeling that, as I argue in the book, that in a very fundamental, deep way, we're wired to want to pursue the unknown. That we're not wired to sort of get to the destination and be like, all right, we're here now. I'm not. We're always looking for the next thing in ways that can be very productive or sometimes unproductive if it becomes if you sort of lose the ability to ever enjoy, getting to your summit or whatever the case may be. But I think it's a deep thing that we all experience in different ways and in different contexts, but is there for deep evolutionary reasons.
You talked about this idea of the explore exploit dilemma. Can you explain what that is for the listeners that haven't read your book yet?
Yeah. So, when I started digging into the literature about exploration, this is the concept that dominates the way scientists have. Like, there's different ways of thinking about exploration, and there's sort of philosophical ways and personal development ways, and there's science or business ways. And so scientists will try and put people in situations where you have to choose between exploring something new or exploiting the knowledge you already have. And once you start to think about decisions this way, you realize that these decisions are everywhere in our lives. And one of the classic illustrations is you go to a restaurant that you've been to before. Do you order the hamburger that it was good, you had it last time, it's fine, or do you try the special, which you have no idea, maybe it's going to be better, like it's special, right? Like maybe it's the best meal they can make. On the other hand, maybe it's the special because it's the fish left over from 2 days ago that they need to get rid of, and it's going to be terrible. So and you have no way of knowing until you order it. And of course there's all sorts of layers of hope and regret. Like you order the special, someone else at the table orders the burger, and then you get the special, and you're eating the fish, and you're like, oh man, I could have had the burger. Look how good it's so juicy. So we agonize. At least I don't know. I don't think I'm alone in saying we agonize about these about these decisions, and not just about which one should we take, but why am I doing this? What does it say about me that I always order the burger? Or so. But so that's on the micro level. You can zoom out, and it's like career decisions, relationship decisions. Do you explore for a better boyfriend or girlfriend, or do you not exploit? Is a word that has some bad connotations, but in this case, do you stick with what you know? Mm-hmm. If you're a company, is it R&D versus research? If you're a society, what do you value? So we're always facing these decisions, and what's the crucial point about the exploring option is that you don't know how it's going to turn out.
Mm-hmm. Particularly when you zoom out of the restaurant example, you start talking about society. But I'm specifically thinking about the athletes that I work with on a daily basis, where they're juggling like, I don't know which trip I should do this year. I don't know which races I should run. Those types of decisions, and all these factors go into who else is going to be there, how competitive will the field be, am I going to get points for the finals that I want to enter, like all these factors, right? And at a certain point, like it often comes down to values. Like I value the points because I really want to go to the UTMB World Finals, so the points are super important. So I'm going to choose to go to canyons instead of something else that weekend. So how does that manifest, though, in terms of like how the scientists think about these things when values are something that are very human, very subjective among individuals? Is there, that's I'm dying to hear your answer about this.
Yeah. So in the lab, when scientists are studying explore exploit decisions, they'll try and strip it of all this context, right? So
Okay.
they'll try and the way they end up studying it is what's with in many cases is with what's called a multi-armed bandit game, where it's basically it becomes a gambling game. You go in and there's a bunch of slot machines, which are one-armed bandits, and you don't know what the payoff or probability for each of these machines are, so you have to kind of explore the different machines and then find which one you think is best and exploit that with your money. And okay, there's an inherent value in there, which is that money is good or whatever that you want to do, or competition is good, whatever you want to do as well as you can in this game. But it's this ultra simplified, you're just playing the odds of what you think is going to pay off. And so I had this discussion with a magazine editor a few months ago, where I was trying to explain the explore exploit dilemma, and using the example of a career decision, like, oh well, what if, because by studying the math of these slot machine games, you can come up with various rules about how you should approach these, or not rules, but guidelines. Oh, you should be optimistic in the face of uncertainty. You should choose a path that has choose an option that has a route to your best possible outcome, even if it's low probability, because then you'll be less likely to regret the choice than if you choose something. If you choose a job that is more stable, but more of a dead end, not going to lead you anyway. So you can go down that path, but what the editor said to me is like, hang on, this is like, you're telling people to make this decision based on whether it has a route to their best possible scenario, but we don't know whether this person, maybe they're trying to support they have to support their extended family right now, and maybe that, blah blah blah. There's all these contextual real life things, and it was a good wake up call for me. It's like, yes, we can't make decisions purely on the basis of attraction to the unknown or optimism in the face of uncertainty. It has to be embedded in all the other factors that we decide, and some of those are like this editor was pointing out, very real. Like, by taking the explore option, you're going to risk not being able to eat tomorrow, then that's a bad decision, independent of your whatever you're itching for. But on a more subtle level than just like, can you eat tomorrow? Like things like values, like you're talking about. The explore option may lead you somewhere that is it's an itch that you feel, but it's going to lead you somewhere that's not consistent with the way you want to live your life. And so I guess the short answer to your question is, these sorts of the explore exploit framing of the question is just one dimension in your decision matrix, and there have to be others, and sometimes those others have to be more important. And so even going back to my post Endure, like, what do I want to do? I was in an extraordinarily privileged position that Endure had done well enough that I didn't have to just sort of say, let's do whatever it takes to make sure I can pay my rent next year or next month or whatever the case may be. So I started out as a freelance journalist in 2006. And if you say, and you look at what I used to write about, and I wrote about jazz, I wrote about philosophy, I wrote about accounting. I went to accounting conferences and wrote for accounting magazines. And on one hand, it's like, wow, that was really exploratory. That was awesome. Like, I was pursuing all these different interests, pre-existing interests like music and sports, but also things that I'd never even thought about. I hadn't studied philosophy, but I went to a philosophy, I did stories on a philosophy professor. I didn't have any interest in accounting, but actually that kind of, so it's like, that was really exploratory. But if you look back to what was my actual decision matrix then, it was like, I'm a freelance journalist. I need to pay my rent. I will take any assignment I can get. I will leverage any connection I can get. So it's, it would be reinterpreting history to say I was exploring at that point.
Sure. Yeah. And so that was where I was going to ask, what I was going to ask you next is, if you look back at these big decisions, do you see them as acts of courage, or just a necessary course correction that you needed to do?
There's a mix, I would say. So, I mean, I would say the decision to write The Explorer's Gene was, almost an overly conscious decision of like, let's let's take a chance. Let's be exploratory. Let's lead down a path where like when I started writing the Explorer's Gene, I didn't know the science of, I wasn't immersed in the science of this area. So I didn't even know how much science there was. And so that actually made it a very hard book to write, because 2 years in, I'd be like, holy crap, there's the whole branch of research that I'd never come across. How did I miss this? Oh my God. Like, so I was over a year late on this book. Now, the decision when I left physics, for example, and decided to go to journalism school, I can tell that story in like 5 different ways, in terms of what were the key moments where it crystallized in my mind, and it's very hard to get back into my head at that point. Like sometimes I'll be like, oh yeah, I'd never even thought about journalism. And then I'll be like, oh wait, but I volunteered for like a month at a student newspaper when I was in grad school. So I must have been interested in it then. So I don't think I would have explicitly framed it as I need to explore at that point, or it's the call of the unknown. I think that played a role. I think I was just like the trajectory in scientific careers is, you start out, in high school, you're taking 9 different science courses or whatever. And at the beginning of university, you're taking still you're taking biology and chemistry and physics and math and, calculus and algebra. And you start to get narrower and narrower. And then, you go through your PhD and you're getting quite narrow. And then I was doing my postdoc, and the trajectory is you're eventually like the world expert on almost nothing, right? Like you're on this super narrow area. And I think I was feeling the constraints. And I mean, brilliant scientists can break out of those shackles, right? They can jump across disciplines, and they're
Sure.
creative. I was a scientist who was maybe not going to be able to do that, and I could feel the walls closing in. And I think part of why I left was I wanted a broader palette to play in. But yeah, it's hard to rewind the tape and know exactly what was going on in my mind.
And I didn't go down that path personally, but I have very close friends who did go down the academic path in different branches of science, especially knowing them through our 20s and 30s when they were working really hard. It was extremely competitive. The chairs that they were aiming for at the end, that they could then, continue to do the research they wanted to do. I mean, there was a very narrow path to that outcome. So I many times thought to myself during those decades, like, wow, I'm glad I didn't go down that way, because I wouldn't have made it that far. And some of them are professors at universities, and some of them hold chairs now, and some of them are. One of them went and opened a specialty audio retail shop. So that's there's a wide variety of outcomes there. So I can totally understand how that would feel. Those walls could feel closing in. And I also hearing that, and having read you for years and years, you are a journalist, and just perhaps I'm mixing the real Alex with the journalist Alex. You are a science guy. Like, you get into the details of what the paper says and how the study was done, and what studies it's referenced, where it's published, who reviewed it. All these things are important in your mind, and that obviously is partially, I would think, has to be somewhat formed from your science education that you underwent.
Yeah, and it is like I thank you for that. That's nice, and for sure. And so if I were to be given a time machine, it's like, do you wish you'd started journalism when you were 21 instead of 28 or 30 or what? By the time I finished journalism school, no. And part of for a couple of reasons. One is that I had fun doing my PhD and doing some research. That was pretty cool to be exposed to that world. But also I'm a totally different journalist than I would have been had I gone to journalism school at 17 or 18 instead of at 28. Now, that's fine. Like, some people know they want to be journalists, and some people know they want to be whatever they want to be at a young age, and that's great. I didn't, but I definitely don't view those years I spent in my 20s as a waste because and I can say cliches like the journey was more important than the destination, and I think those cliches are true. That's why they're cliches, that I enjoyed the journey, but also the destination is different as a result, and I think I'm a different and hopefully a better journalist than I would have been if I'd been studying journalism for those years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think this is part of the exploration of Voice of the Mountains, is trying to understand why we do the things that we do and why we're so passionate about them. And it brings together a lot of the points that you bring up in your book, and we've even touched on so far, where, it's there's an exploration component, there's like understanding who I am component. You also talk about an idea called the effort paradox, which I think applies here, because to me it's very much a part of doing the hard thing is to become someone because you did the hard thing. You are a different journalist because you had this rigorous hard science education. You wouldn't see the world the way you do if you hadn't done that. You can't separate that anymore, and that's part of what makes you a great journalist. And so, uh, how do you think? Also, as a runner, as a lifelong runner yourself, how do you think about this effort paradox and how it connects into ideas like whether it's, a decision related to which run to do next, or a decision to what to explore next, academically or cognitively?
Yeah. So this idea of an effort paradox is something that really spoke to me. And so basically, just to state it clearly, I think the most distinct way of stating it is it's that we sometimes we enjoy things not in spite of the fact that they're difficult, but because they're difficult, or not just enjoy. Sometimes we value things
Yeah.
precisely because they're hard. And so to zoom out a bit and back to the beginning of your question about um, like understanding our motivations and the different motivations. The first thing I'll say is that I'm suspicious of anyone who thinks they know, who's confident that they know why they do the things they do. That at least I can only generalize from my own personal experiences, but I find it very difficult to be sure that I know why I'm doing what I'm doing. I know what I kind of with enough introspection, I know what it is I want to do, whether it's leave journalism or write a book about exploring. Why do I want to do it? That's harder. And I can always, as I said, I can tell the story in different ways. And I think in general we are multi motivated. Like we have different motivations that come together. But this idea of doing the hard thing. I mean, one thing I'll say is, how did I end up in physics? Like, coming out of high school, I liked a lot of things. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was really torn, and I think probably the most influential piece of advice I got, and it was from some friends of my parents, just saying, if you don't know what you're going to do, make sure you do something hard, because you can move from something hard to, excuse me, to something that's a little easier, but you can't move up the gradient. It's much harder to, like, if I studied English literature, which I would have loved, at 28, I couldn't have said, man, maybe I'll be a physicist. Maybe I'll catch up on 10 years. It doesn't go that way. So in a sense, I did physics because it was the hardest thing I could think of. And that was in keeping with who I was as a runner. Like the quote, the slogan on the backs of the t-shirt is, my sport is your sport's punishment. Like we're doing the thing that's hard. And I, when I think about this, you go back to George Mallory, like, why are you climbing Everest? Because it's there. And it's like, the classically, we remember that not because it's a good answer, but because it's a bad answer. It doesn't tell you anything, but it speaks to the fact that, as I was saying before, we don't always know why we're doing what we're doing. And so I think the effort paradox was the first time a kind of light went off in my head of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. A lot of my decisions are based around this idea that things that are difficult feel meaningful. It feels like you have a purpose when you're undertaking this hard thing, whether it's climbing upwards or veering off to the right in your career. And so I think it's a pretty good unifying theory, and I think it's also not a bad kind of organizing principle for decision making.
Yeah. I mean, it really resonated with me because to me, it sort of explained all of climbing in 2 words. Because
Yeah.
if you think about climbing, and I know you've taken up rock climbing as a hobby, according to
At a very low level.
well, yeah, but we climbers have essentially created imaginary systems of numbers that just a system of numbers that just we pulled out of a hat to rank which climb is harder than the other climb. And which climb do we value the most? The one that's the most difficult. And how is that judged? Well, just by like how many people can do it, and how hard they think it is compared to other things that they've done. It's all completely subjective. And if you go into alpinism, like my kind of niche part of that sport, you know, we were never interested in climbing Everest because that was super easy. I've been done lots of times. We were interested only in doing the really the hard, like what's the biggest unclimbed wall in the world that we can find. Let's go do that. Like nobody, what has nobody done before? And then even better, what have people been trying to do for 20, 30, 40 years and not been able to do? That's the more effort is gone into trying to do it and failing, then the bigger the prize is when finally somebody pulls it off and all the stars align. And for me, that effort paradox idea just immediately explained all of this.
Well, I mean, I think there is the sort of paradigmatic expression of what is the effort paradox. The effort paradox is that people climb mountains by deliberately taking the harder route up. It's like, so, you can get all mushy in terms of motivations, in terms of like, well, you want to get to the top because it's so beautiful up there, or because because you want the satisfaction of making it to the top. It's like, the whole point of or the whole existence of alpinism is like, it doesn't matter. It's not about who got to the top. It's how did you get there? What route did you take? And it's not, you were so clever, you found an easier route to make it to the top. It's no, you were so great, you found a ridiculously hard route. Let's, it's like and so there's this definition of games or of playing games, but from a philosopher named Bernard Suits, that it's the voluntary acceptance of, or the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. I mean, that is a description of climbing mountains. And
Yeah.
we all know intuitively that if there's an escalator on the backside of the mountain, or more realistically, if there's a gondola on the other side of the mountain, nobody, for a certain type of person in a certain context, you're not interested in the gondola. The point is not to be at the top. So yeah, the effort paradox is, I mean, mountain climbing is the example of the effort paradox, and the sort of the existence of mountain climbing is what tells us that we're not like rational economic beings just trying to get the best view, or there's something about the effort that calls to us.
And I would argue that the whole trail running category of running would fit into this too. And I've had this discussion with my fellow coaches and athletes where, you have people trying to decide, okay, I want to go, I don't know, to a certain location to do a certain race because I've never been there before, for example. Those are valid reasons. And then you also have people who are like, well, I just want to go do this FKT because, fill in the blank, whatever the reason is. But all of those things are ultimately decisions, that are prioritizing, this magical point between what they say I can do and what I think I can do that's a little bit more than what people say I can do. And it's not impossible, or at least I don't think it's impossible, but it's going to change how I show up in the world, because all of a sudden I'm the person that can run a 2:30 marathon instead of a person that can run a 3:30 marathon. Like those are very, in the running world, if you can
Or 230 versus 231. It's a world of difference.
It's a huge difference, right?
In some contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. And so though within those social groups, that becomes very, very important.
Yeah. And I mean, this zone you're talking about of just, on the border of what you're capable of, that is the magic zone. And, when people talk about flow states and stuff, that's one of the preconditions. It's like, you need to be trying to do something that is hard, but, in theory, achievable. And so, when I think about why people run, we have all these explanations about runner's high and, mental clarity and stuff. And there are definitely, I think that's part of it. And there are people whose primary experience of running is just to get out and clear their heads. But for people who get deeper into it, I think it's not just about going out and running. You have to find some challenge for yourself that you're not sure you can do. That's what really becomes addictive isn't the word I'm looking for here, but compelling. And it's like, it's not exciting to do something you can do. And so just, my version of you not climbing Everest is me like, can you run a marathon, Alex? It's like, that was not interesting to me. Like I ran close to a marathon in training for a 1 mile race. I knew I could run a marathon, and I did eventually run one once for a magazine story, but I wanted a challenge that I wasn't sure I could do. But one that was possible, not, my goal was not to, run a 2-minute mile or set a world record. Neither of those things were possible to me. But one of the nice things about running and about any good hobby is that you can find it's infinitely scalable. Like I said, between 2:30 and 2:31 for a marathon or whatever, you can set the challenge at just the level that will keep you interested. And setting that challenge appropriately is, I think, a skill that helps differentiate who ends up sticking with these activities over the long haul. That they continue to find ways that are challenges that are attainable but not easy.
Mm-hmm. You've talked elsewhere and written elsewhere about consistency being one of the primary predictors and keys to performance. And with explorers, are this people, I'll throw myself firmly in that basket of people that always have to kind of look around the corner, or ski down into the next valley, or climb that next mountain over there that they see. How does that kind of explorers' drive and the need for new challenges balance with the need for consistency to become good enough, again, relative to your goals, to master something difficult like running? Like, running is, people think it's super easy. Of course, biomechanically, maybe it's, to do it at least average, it's not that hard, but to do running well is extremely difficult.
There's a tension, yeah, for sure. There's a tension between those things, and you can think of that tension in the context of maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but in the context of things like ADHD. So one of the things I read about in the book is that, there's and I won't go too deep down this rabbit hole, but there's a gene related to a dopamine receptor that is linked to heightened exploratory behavior in people historically and in the present. And that gene is also linked to ADHD. And so you can see that, like, traits that were really adaptive for hunter-gatherers that lead to greater success as a hunter-gatherer, the desire to always find out what's over the next hill, whether there's something better to eat or somewhere better to live. That was really helpful. And it's maybe not adaptive in grade 11 when you're supposed to sit still all day and listen to the teacher. And so, the need to explore, it's not inherently good or bad, but it's context specific. And so if you want to be great at running or at, most other things, there comes a time when you have to knuckle down and just do it. And I think, this is obviously a complex topic, but what I would say that one of the interesting insights that comes out of both the math of exploration, but also the analysis of people's career trajectories and how great science happens, is that the optimal is to have periods of exploration followed by periods of exploitation. So if you want to know when an artist is going to paint their greatest works, or when a scientist is going to produce their greatest experiments, if they're in a period that's purely exploratory, they're doing something different every week or every month or every year, that's useful, but they're not likely to, that's not when they're going to do their best work in their career. And similarly, if they're just kind of exploiting, if they're just doing the same thing over and over again, they're not going to do their best work. But if they have a period of exploration, a wide period of exploration where they're really checking out different options until they find the thing that clicks for them, and then they knuckle down into a period of exploitation, that's, and that's when career hot streaks happen. That's when people do their best work as scientists or artists or in other fields. So, as a runner, for sure, like ultimately, how exploratory was I in my 20s? Not very exploratory, because every morning and every evening I was going out for a run, and that, it was often quite hard. And I didn't have a lot of bandwidth for anything else, but I had made the choice that I wanted to see how good I could be as a runner. And so, unlike mountain climbing, trying to be your best as a runner does not involve traveling around the world a lot, except during the competition season. So yeah, you have to think about the context, and sometimes you have to turn off that exploratory gene, or you have to be willing to knuckle down.
If you're enjoying the show and want to take the next step in your training, join our newsletter and receive a free 4-week sample training plan. Head on over to uphillathlete.com/letsgo, and once you sign up, you'll instantly get a link to try out some of our most popular training plans. It's a great way to get a feel for how we train our athletes for big mountain goals. Check it out at uphillathlete.com/letsgo. That's uphillathlete.com/LETSGO. It's great to hear you tell that story through your personal experience. For me, it was very similar in that through my 20s, we talked to a lot of athletes about how to develop as an athlete, right? And so it's quite similar to what you said. And for me, my story was in my 20s, I was doing lots of different climbing because I knew I wanted to be an alpinist, and alpinism is kind of like the decathlon of climbing. You have to be pretty good at everything, but you're not the best at any one subdiscipline of climbing, mountaineering. And then I reached a point where I just cut out everything I could and just focused on, okay, what do I need to do to train, to have enough money to go on these trips, to, line up all these things. And that was the mission statement and nothing else. And it's hard, I think, today, especially for the younger climbers in this environment where a lot of value is put on validation of having done, and not a lot of value is put on the validation of being in the process of building, or, as you said, knuckle under and just running. And that's what most of it actually is. How do you take what you've learned from writing these books and talking to people? How do you frame that up for people, and what do you tell them?
Yeah, the challenge is that the best thing to tell people is something they've heard over and over, about journeys and destinations, but you have to keep hearing it. And I have to keep telling it to myself. Like, this is not a lesson you can learn once. So, I mean, my athletic story is that the most important thing in my life until I was 28 was trying to run faster on the track. I really, really, really wanted to make the Olympics, and I did not make the Olympics. And so the most, look, if I could, alter the trajectory of history, of course I would make sure that I made the Olympics. But not having made the Olympics, gave me a valuable lesson, which was that, I looked back, and to my surprise, as I moved on from that portion of my life, I was like, I don't regret a damn thing. That was an awesome time. And not just that I got to, travel around and race in some cool places. The feeling of having gone absolutely as hard as I could on this one thing, of having left no stone unturned, of having really exposed myself in the sense of like, I'm doing everything. I have no excuses. It's not like I could have been better if I'd tried harder. I tried as hard as I could and I got as far as I could. And that was such a powerful experience. Like even at the time I was sort of conscious of this, of, being in a race or let's say finishing a really hard workout at the end of a really hard training week and thinking, there's not many people on this planet who have given their all to something in the way that I'm doing right now. And so that lesson, I think, I've taken into the journalism world. When I was writing Endure, I had, my mind was filled with doubts about whether anyone else really cared as much about the nuts and bolts of the science of endurance as I did. And because I sort of, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but I created this sense in my mind that my career was hanging in the balance, that if this book did well, I'd make it as a journalist. And if it didn't do well, I would have to go mop floors. But I was able to kind of talk myself down from the ledge and say, Alex, just write the book you want to write. Write the best damn book you can write about endurance. And, hopefully people will like it. But if not, it'll be just like that, the 10 years of your life you spent running, where you didn't make the Olympics, but you have no regrets about giving it your all. And so I tried to take that with me for Explorers Gene. And, honestly, it doesn't mean that was not, and I'm still not full of doubts and worries and like hopes and all this stuff. All that stuff doesn't go away, but it gives me a sort of, you talked about values. It gives me a sort of bedrock where I can, when I'm feeling like, oh crap, I can't believe that, it's not going well or whatever. I spent whatever it was for this book, 5 years doing it because I thought it was worth doing. So it doesn't really matter what happens now, because the process was valuable.
Yeah. And you've been able to knuckle down on this process, whatever, at least 3 or 4, I don't know, probably more times in different areas of your life. And I know people are going to ask, and I don't know, so I have to ask, it was 1,500 meters. Was that your event?
Yeah. I ultimately, look, that's a complicated answer too. I think I might've been better at 5,000, but I had injuries, but I ran 3:42 for 1,500, which is right around a 4-minute mile, which is national class. It's, but not quite good enough to take the next step up.
A lot of our listeners are runners, and they're going to love to know that. So when you think back to that, let's say first, and I'm presuming that it's running is maybe that first love or that first thing that you left no stone unturned on in pursuit of. Where did that come from? What was the impetus? Like, what made you leave? What made you go so hard for that?
Yeah. I mean, this is a question I think a lot about, because my kids are now 9 and 11, and I want them to care about things in life and to push themselves hard. But I really, really, I'm unclear. Like, and so I look back and I'm trying to figure, so what was it? Cause it wasn't, my parents didn't push me into running. They didn't know anything about running. And so my feeling is, I need to back off. I need to model for them the way I think people should live, without like pushing them. And not to go too far down a tangent, but my wife was also a very, very good runner. But she had a very different childhood than me. She was running when she was, 8 years old, and her dad was training for a marathon. So she has a model of like active parental engagement and leadership, and hey, let's get you joining a club at 8. Whereas I have a model of, let's just leave the kids alone and see what they stumble into to see. But then the worry is, it's like, okay, if I leave them alone and just let them hang around, they're going to decide that actually sitting on the sofa and playing video games is a really fulfilling way to live their life. And then I'll feel really stupid. So, I mean, I think honestly, though, with running for me, I think this is actually somewhat counter to the usual trajectory, is that probably external validation got me in the door, that I was good at running. So I won races. And so like when I first joined a track club when I was about 15, it was because I had 3 more months left to run in the younger age group in high school. And I thought, well, I'll just train for these 3 months to try and beat up on these little kids. But then I did way better than I expected. And I was like, well, okay, I'm hooked. I'll keep training. And so for me, I would say the click actually didn't come until about a year after my undergraduate, when I was then in graduate school. I got a knee injury that ended up lingering for a couple of years. And so that derailed my track career. And as time went on, my worries went from like, am I going to miss this season, to am I going to miss this year, to am I going to be able to get back to where I was? And then I realized I was just worried about like, am I going to be able to run again? Because I really liked running. I really want to. And that was almost an epiphany to me, to realize that at some point I had internalized, or I had fallen in love with the with the process, and that yes, I still wanted to get back to competition, but running I had a different relationship with running at that point once it was taken away from me. But I know, like, so the usual thing is that people start doing things they love, and then they get external validation, and the external validation replaces the internal validation. They start only doing it because other people tell them they're good at it. For me, at least as I think about this just now, it feels like it was almost the opposite way. That it started out, I was doing it because I was good at it, and then I realized that I loved it, but it was only having it taken away that prompted that level of reflection to realize how much I liked it, independent of the results.
Yeah. And there's so many paths to this, right? Like, I have a couple of friends that have achieved a lot in their lives. And our joke among the three of us is that we're the insecure overachievers club. Like, we have to prove it to ourselves because, somehow we weren't born with that feeling that we can do whatever we want. And so we have this internal critic that's always saying, you can't do that. And it's like, to show the internal critic that they're wrong, that I can do this. And there are many paths to this. And I also always tell people that these pathways only reveal themselves as you're walking on them. Or another way to put it is, these ideas just don't simply come out fully formed, right? Like, in hindsight, it looks like a clear trajectory. Oh, I went from this to this to this to this. But in reality, it was a bunch of little steps, and some of them were left, some of them were right. And when you zoom way out, it looks like it goes forward, but the forward could have been lots of other directions.
Yeah, I definitely would say distrust anyone who's, well, maybe not anyone, other people may be different, but distrust trajectory stories that are too linear and that make sense. That there has to be some meandering, and that meandering is, in terms of the story, or the idea is not emerging fully formed, that you learn them as they walk the path. It's like, what I find is often when I think these things through, I feel like, I understand it all now, and it all makes sense. And then I realized that this idea that I've understood through 10 years of journey is just like, it's something that people were telling me the whole time. It's the advice that I was already like. And again, the sort of most prominent cliche is, that value the journey, not the destination. It's like, it doesn't matter how many times people have told me that, but there's a sense that in living it, I could only fully grasp that it's like, yeah, the running, as much as I enjoyed running good times, that's not really what I mostly remember about running. Or it's not even the most positive things I remember about running is not the finish of the race.
And I'm dwelling on this because this is one of the larger themes that I want to pull through this season of this Voice of the Mountains project, where I have this theory that learning to do hard things in a field like running or climbing teaches you that you have the ability to do hard things in other parts of life, whether it's writing books or running companies or, there's a million other ways to express doing hard things. And very often doing a hard thing in not always, but doing a hard thing in sport very often does not have any value to anyone else other than, the person, couple people that were involved in doing it. But doing hard things in other areas of life, medical, literature, all kinds of other, could potentially have massive benefits and value to other people. And the process we focus on, oh, well, that scientist discovered such and such, and that was, penicillin, and that led to this, changed the trajectory of the world and changed world history. It's like, well, how did Pasteur learn to try and fail and rerun experiments and do this and do that to, eventually essentially stumble into a discovery that, was probably bound to happen at some point, because but yet still changed the world. There was all these things that happened before in the development of that human that allowed them to try and fail and keep going. And yeah, even the pursuit of an education in medicine, especially at that time, was out of grasp for, I don't know what percentage, but the vast majority of humans on the planet at that time. So there's a lot of steps that happen before the big result.
Yeah, and I definitely, obviously, it will be no surprise to anyone that I share your thoughts about doing hard things in one sphere can lead to, or can help inform your ability to do it in other spheres. And again, I think about that a lot with my kids, and for better or worse, we've taken our kids out on some fairly demanding backpacking trips, and we're not assholes. So my my wife and I will be like, did we misjudge this time? Like if one of them is struggling. But we really, I look at my daughters who are 9 and 11, and it's like, I believe that they have a confidence in their ability to endure, their ability to keep going even when they don't want to. And it's like, I make the analogy to this even when we're sitting at the table, and it's like, yeah, I don't like mushrooms or whatever. It's like, I get it. And, I don't serve you mushrooms often, but sometimes when you get a food you don't like, sometimes you just do it. In fact, I was reading Scott Jurek's book recently, and that's one of his dad's sayings would be like, sometimes you just do things. And I think you learn that if you're climbing a mountain or if you're out on a backpacking trip, it becomes real, because if my daughter's asking me, like, I just want to sit down, it's like, well, this is no longer daddy just being a jerk making you do something. We are out in the mountains now, so we don't have a choice. You can sit down here and die, or we can keep walking. And they might not love that answer, but then much like, okay, well, I guess we'll get up and keep walking. And or even like, just not even, it doesn't have to be in the mountains. It's like, my kids walk to school. It's about a mile. And it doesn't matter if it's raining or snowing, they walk to school. And it's like, I think a small thing like that, I flatter myself to think that they're learning a lesson about just getting it done.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about your story of them, on a backpacking trip and sitting down, and then having to, when they're sitting down, they're like, no, I can't. And this is also so true in so many of these sports, is like, if you have to, actually, it turns out you can, right? Like there's endless examples of this in sports, and particularly in endurance, and your book is full of several of them, but yeah.
Yeah, like, so I loved it. I think it was Amby Burfoot, who was a mentor of mine at Runner's World, who his explanation of the greatest workout that you can possibly do is 5 times a mile as hard as you can, and then when you're done and you're lying in the gas, gasping for breath, the coach comes over and says, "Do one more," and you say, "Well, I can't. I did them as hard as I can." Like you said, it's like, tough. Do another one. You get up and you're like, "Oh, I did another one in almost the same speed," and even so, outside of the sports realm, I had a boss who I really liked, and when I was a postdoctoral physics researcher, the boss was quite a character. And when something was, he would be requesting some, like, I need this adjustment to my lab or something. I need something built here, and the administration response would come back, "Oh, we can't do this." And his response is always like, you can't or you won't. And, you know, it was an obnoxious response, but it was also, it's one that I often think about for myself and for other people. It's like, when you say you can't do that, you actually just mean you won't, right? But you could do it. Just like my daughter, you can get up and walk. Your legs are still working. You just are tired. And I understand that, but you can do it.
What is going on physiologically when sorry, we have to go into physiology at least once in this conversation. When you do that 6th mile, and you know, it's so interesting because, you know, in live, we don't get to do this very often with Uphill Athlete because we're coaching remotely. But one of the things when I've had the opportunity to coach people live, especially, you know, the oldest trick is in the book is in the weight room is, you know, the athlete, you know, you're just putting the weights on the bar for them. You're not, you know, maybe they think it's their usual weight, but it's actually much, you know, maybe not drastically, but 5% more. And they think that they can't do that. But, you know, they start doing it and they're like, well, this is hard, but they still do the 8 reps or whatever you prescribed. And then at the end, you tell them, oh, by the way, did you notice that was a PR or whatever? So the brain has this way of tricking us, and we can reverse it and trick each other with this tool. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a trick you can't play every week, right?
Right.
It's a tool to be used valuably. No, but so I think a couple things to say about that. One is, to me, I think the way I think about this physiologically, the most convincing explanation about this is that the master switch that determines whether you can keep going or maintain a pace or lift a weight is your subjective sense of effort, of how hard it is. So you're running along. I'll use running because it's the easiest example for me. You're running along at a given pace. Your rival starts to pull away, and your decision about whether to try and stay with them, fundamentally, it's not that at that moment in time you're running as fast as your legs can physically go. At any moment in a marathon, right up until the final 100 meters or something, if a lion jumped out from behind the nearest lamppost, you would start sprinting. You still have the ability to go faster, but you're judging that it's not prudent for you to start sprinting with 10 miles to go still left in the marathon. So you're making your decision based on a subjective effort, and that effort does depend on all the physiological stuff. It depends on your core temperature and the lactate levels in your blood and your respiration rate and yada, yada, yada. But it also depends on the thoughts in your head, because if you're asking yourself, can I maintain pace and stay with my rival? If what you've been telling yourself for the last hour is, oh, this is awful, I'm having a terrible day, obviously I screwed up my training, or boy, that injury I had last month must have really messed with my training, I can't do this, I'm just not tough enough, I always fail in these situations, then you're just far more likely to answer, no, I can't do it, because you have all these reasons already teed up for why you can't do it. Whereas if your internal monologue is like, this is good, everyone else is hurting just as much as me, it's hard, this is what I trained for, that I did the best training I possibly could, and I'm ready, this is the day where I want to give, you're just more likely to be willing to push. And so the feeling that you can't go any farther, I think that the crux is that it is not a representation of your leg's inability to move. It's a warning light. Your brain is getting into that zone where it feels that you probably better hold off. And so you can turn that warning light off, not indefinitely and not forever, because eventually it's going to come back on, and instead of orange, it's going to be red. But it's a negotiation as opposed to an ultimatum from your brain that you can't go. And so if you fiddle with those settings by changing the input, then you find you might be able to squeeze a little bit more out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I like all the input idea. We work with a lot of athletes who have not done formal training before. And so with them, very often I start them with a heart rate monitor, because they don't have a sense of what is easy and what is hard. They've not used training zones before. But once people have been doing that for a while, we often can just get rid of that and go by feeling, because then the train by feel is more like, you have all the inputs. You know what the temperature is, you know what your hydration level is, you know if you've slept well, and you know what your heart rate is and your perception of that exertion, the kind of RPE idea. And that's when, once we get people to that, then we can really like make a lot more, I would say you make less progress because the biggest gains come in the beginning, right?
Right.
But you really get to a point where you can really help them understand their body and how it works and how their physiology is changing to adapt to being able to do long duration, running or climbing or alpinism or mountaineering, whatever the sport is. And it's really interesting to see people go through that process. And there's definitely a learning curve for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree that it's for people who grew up in a sport. Like, I started running seriously when I was, let's say, 15. It's sometimes hard to remember that the average quote unquote civilian has done very few things that will put them in as much prolonged, if they're lucky, assuming that, like, leaving trauma and stuff out of it, but physically has done has rarely experienced the kind of distress that you can go into in an interval workout and stay there for an hour and you're not dying because you've done this before. But for someone who's just doing a couch to 5K or something, or just getting into something, you absolutely have to calibrate those feelings and help them understand what's possible through experience, but also through telling them what's what. And then in terms of like moving to the field-based approach, which is that's certainly how I run. I have a complicated relationship with data. Like I'm fascinated by the science and like, oh, what can we learn from heart rate variability and real-time tracking of lactate or glucose or whatever the case may be. But I will say I have yet to see any data or any convincing demonstration that all the data we're currently able to collect can make better decisions or be a more sensitive marker of how you feel than asking, how do you feel? If you're someone who's tuned into your sensations. So I'm not anti-data.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not anti-data either. I think that a lot of people want the right answer, and they want it from a credible source.
Yeah.
And they want it to be as digestible and simple and easy to understand and utilize as possible, which are all valid wants. But the reality of being in a human body is often a little more complicated than your HRV tells you to do this today or to not do this today. That's one reading on a variety of things. And I understand people are hoping that it captures a bunch more than that. But again, I also haven't seen that any of these features do.
The other thing is that the reality of training and of doing hard things is that you do have to ride that edge sometimes. You have to make a difficult decision of like, okay, I'm very tired. I've been training hard this week. Sometimes to do well in running, you have to train when you're very tired, but you also like, and so you have to face, am I being a coward? Am I saying I don't want to do this workout because I think I'm getting sick or something? Or is it just that I'm like tired and so these decisions become all sorts of, the internal dilemma. And so the best case scenario for me is have a good relationship with the coach, and then the coach can make that decision. And then, I have a conversation. The coach knows me. I say how I'm feeling, and they're like, yeah, give it a try, or go for it, or back off, or go half. And so for me, that offloading the moral dimension of making that decision is helpful. Not everyone has that relationship available to them, and so I think people are looking for that from data. It's like, oh well, my readiness score said I wasn't ready to go today, so that's why I'm taking today off. Not because I'm being lazy, because we all fight with that,
right?
Like that ambiguity of when to push when we're already tired.
Yeah. You've said that, I don't remember where I heard you say this, but you talked about how ultra running is kind of the Wild West because it's so of running, the Wild West of running, because it's such a hard place to kind of collect information, collect data, understand, predict performances for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that the terrain is super variable. The weather can have a really outsized effect on performances and other things. As a journalist that is, at least from my viewpoint, very grounded in the, peer-reviewed research side of things, how do you pull that apart? How do you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's a struggle and it's a tension because my preference always, the way, when I write sweat science columns for Outside, almost always the starting point is a single peer-reviewed study. Like someone has done an experiment and they've published it. Now, I'm not just going to take that experiment and swallow it whole. I'm going to try and evaluate where it fits in with a larger body of literature. And I'm going to look for trying to understand what the strengths and weaknesses and what it can tell us and what it can, blah, blah, blah. So that's where I'm most comfortable. So how do I deal with ultra running? Like you said, there's a lot of sources of variability. First of all, like it's a lot. It's very hard to get, 20 volunteers to come in and say, okay, we're going to have you run 100 miles as hard as you can on 4 different occasions under slightly different conditions in the lab on a treadmill. And then, of course, even if you could, it's like, what does that treadmill tell you about how someone is going to perform at Western States or whatever, or, at altitude or in heat or whatever. So there's all these known sources of uncertainty. But I think there's an even deeper one, which is, let's say all we cared about was the, 100-mile record on the track. So it's going to be a very predictable conditions. It's an indoor track. So we're going to control all the conditions. And we have a bunch of crazy volunteers who are willing to do a bunch of studies for us where they're going to do a bunch of 100 miles on the track and we can test all these different conditions. Even then, my reading of the very patchy literature on ultra running is that the longer the distance goes, the less predictive physiological variables are. So, if you want to know who's going to win a mile, if you know VO2 max, lactate threshold, running economy, maybe some other parameters, but those 3 are the big ones. You can go a long way. It's never perfect, but it's like, yeah, you can all the way up to a marathon. You still, lactate threshold, VO2 max, running economy. You have a pretty good idea of how the race is going to pan out. The longer you go, and there's been a few studies that have compared like ultras where there's a 50K, a 50 mile, a 100 mile. And it's like the value of those predictors goes down even within a given race. And, my sort of interpretation of that is that the longer you go, the more it's coming down to the mental side of performance. And we don't have any ways or we have very imperfect ways of quantifying what's going on in someone's head. So fundamentally, ultra running, I think, is a demonstration of the idea or the claim that the mind, that it's not, we're not just doing a physiology measuring contest, but it means that it's hard to write much about the physiology, and it's hard to write about the psychology because that's so personal. It's hard to say, well, here are the 4 things you should say when you're halfway through a 100-mile race.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. When you're, and this could be ultras, but originally, if we go back to Lydiard's time or something, it was the marathon. That used to be the gold standard of endurance. How do you, the way I see that endurance sport specifically, has developed over the decades is that athletes and coaches have trial and errored their way to the best practices. And trial and error, I mean by trying things like doing a lot of base building, doing a lot of high intensity interval training, and then seeing what happens in competition. Does it stack up to the other people that are the best in the world at that time? And then in most cases, the scientists come along later and explain why things happen the way they happen. One of the things I wanted to ask you is how you handle that, or how you view that as a science writer. And as you said, you typically start with a piece of peer-reviewed research and then try to interpret it. If maybe that's, I'm putting words in your mouth, but you try to interpret it within the context and what we know. Whereas a lot of things, and I've been part of projects that have failed this test, right? Where we used to think, like, both myself and also with as a team of coaches, if we roll back 6, 7, 8 years ago, we were telling people to do a lot of fasted training. Now it's like completely, we know better, partly because literature science came out and said, actually, this is having some very negative effects on these people in other ways, and hormones balances and all these other things. And then we switched, and then guess what? People started to run faster. Now we're maybe swinging the other way. Everybody's consuming as much carbohydrate as they can. and
Yeah.
But for the most part, it's the athlete coach test on the test and competition that is leading things forward from my point of view. Do you have a different point of view? And if so, can you explain how you see that progress in the terms of what we know about endurance training?
Yeah, no. So I would 100% agree that it's the athletes and coaches who are coming up with the ideas and trying them. Inevitably, that process has some blind alleys, and it's, I think it's relatively self-correcting. You don't need a scientist if you've come up with the idea that, let's say, flashing back to the 90s, which was when I started running seriously, that actually low mileage is the way to go. You shouldn't do too much mileage. You should do all speed work. That was, it was sometimes cloaked as a scientific approach, but really it was just some athletes and coaches trying that. And in general, people got slower. And now the problem is, you always have the way this usually works is you have a few examples of people who are like, wow, that guy won the Olympics and he was only doing 2 miles a week or whatever. So then a whole bunch of people are doing it. And then it's like, wow, this whole country is way slower than it was 10 years ago. That sucks. And so there is this self-correcting mechanism, totally independent of any science. Science doesn't even need to come into it. So what now?
Why am I spending a little bit of a scientific process, though, right? Like experimentation, getting just not a peer-reviewed science.
Right, you're right. I shouldn't call it not. There's observation and hypothesis and self-correction. But in terms of the stuff that I write about, it's like, well, why am I devoting my career to writing about peer-reviewed science? Part of it is like, well, hey, that was my competitive advantage. I am comfortable reading the physiology and talking to the scientists, and so it was something that I didn't see a lot of when I was younger, and kind of wished I'd known a little bit more about how this stuff works. But I think the science can play a role in an important role in testing some of these assumptions, and by figuring out, whether let's say something works, but there's different ways of explaining why it works. Well, if we figure out why it works, then we can probably do it better. We can figure out a better way of taking advantage of a tactic that science didn't come up with. And I have a hard time thinking of examples of training methods or performance enhancing methods that came straight out of the lab, as opposed to being validated after athletes had been experimenting. I mean, they exist. Like, people have, it's not that athletes were like, I wonder what ketones will do. Scientists came up with that. Now, the truth is, I don't think ketones do very much, but there are things that come out of the lab that are science first. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, it's like, like training low, training in a depleted state. It's like, well, Miguel Indurain in the 90s was doing 5-hour fasted rides. And I think people have had that idea for a long time. The question is it good or bad? And that it's hard because there's so many variables. Experience doesn't always self-correct quickly enough. And so, a cheap example would be, um, if you look at the list of athletes who endorsed power balance bracelets 15 years ago, these are like pieces of a rubber bracelet that's supposed to align your chakra or something like that. I mean, they're very good athletes. These are like, Shaquille O'Neal is claiming that he scored like 67 points one night because he put on the power balance bracelet. And so experience isn't the perfect guide. So science can test claims that are outright crap like power balance, but it can also try and sort through this complicated thing of like, how many carbohydrates should you be taking when you're in in an ultra endurance event? And it's not easy to answer. And it's not like one experiment is going to resolve it, but I think it's going to guide people more accurately and maybe more quickly than just sort of waiting for the weight of experience to kind of come down on this is how many carbs we should be taking or we shouldn't be taking. Because there's a David Epstein, who we mentioned earlier, he had a line that I've always liked, which is just because you're a bird doesn't mean you're an ornithologist. So, you ask a bird how to fly, you might not get the right answer. So there's, I think, value in that external perspective, but we shouldn't put the cart before, confuse which is where the bulk of the knowledge is coming from is athletes and coaches trying stuff.
Yeah. No, that I agree, and that aligns certainly with my experience. And as coaches on our group chat, just this week we're having I wouldn't call it debate, but a like nobody knows what to do with carbohydrate. Like there's all these like, I did this and my athlete did that and we tried 90 and and we had to do this to get their gut to handle this, and we want to have this conversation with that outside perspective at the same time. Like, what the people studying this, what are they saying? Like, we need to be having more of this back and forth conversation. And I think that can bring a lot of value ultimately to the athletes that are either just trying to be better runners or trying to run their best race or in many cases, especially around nutrition, the topic is, not make themselves sick because, they need to support the training, the load that they have on their bodies from training and competing or traveling in expeditions and so on. And they need to stay healthy. And that's as you know, from your own experience, it's a massive, it's a lot to carry physiologically to be training a lot.
Yeah, and I think that dialogue between the practical world and the scientific world is super important. And the best scientists in this field are ones who are highly attuned to what's happening, to what's going on in the peloton of the Tour de France, and who are testing that. And so you might say, the scientists are always behind. They're always just looking at what the athletes, and it's like, that's what they should be doing. They should be looking at what's going on at the front of the pack and trying to test whether it's a good idea or how does it translate to other people? How individual is it? As opposed to just like, let's try and make up something completely new. And, I think that's less likely to pay fruit. So whenever there's questions that athletes are arguing about, I always am thinking like, even this seems like a boring question. I wish more scientists would study this question because athletes still aren't sure. Like stuff like stretching, like, couldn't we get some better studies on different types of stretching? It's like, there've been hundreds of studies, but we still don't really like have a good sense of what it does in what context for whom and why.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great example. We, again, like we get that question all the time as coaches, and as coaches, we have highly individual responses to that question based on our experiences, and and to a certain, once you have enough experience, if you've been doing this for 20 years, you can give an athlete feedback that's appropriate for them at their
Right.
knowing their body and so on. But that's a narrow case, right? We're hoping for something that helps, let's say, everyone with that kind of knowledge.
Yeah. And that may be a not to be a downer, but that may be a pipe dream. Like, how many carbohydrates should people take? It may be 30 to 180 grams, depending on who you are and what your specific context is. And the who you are part is what makes it hard to write recommendations. look, hopefully science continues to progress and we get more specific answers. But the dream of there being one answer may be a bit of an illusion.
Yes, of course. But we love the idea that there will be certainty waiting for us, right? Like comfortable.
Just around the corner. Just around
the corner.
Just over the next horizon.
One more book. Where can our listeners connect with you online or come to any of your book presentations or read your books?
Yeah, so probably the best place to find me these days is at my website, alexhutchinson.net. And I have a list of upcoming events. There are a few. I'm going around wherever I get an opportunity and giving a talk about exploring and stuff. But also, I am on various social media outlets. There's links there. Usually it's as Sweat Science, sometimes as Sweat_Science. But alexhutchinson.net is probably the best starting place.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Alex. This has been a wonderful conversation and got us off on a great start for our second season of this exploration into, who we are and who we become through doing hard things and thinking about how to do it better. And I really appreciate your voice and keep doing what you're doing. You're fantastic out there, and look forward to connecting again in the future.
Thanks so much for having me, Stephen. It's really an honor to be part of this conversation.
One of the most common questions I get is, how should I get started with training? Well, they say the first step is the hardest, so let's make that easy. We are offering free 4-week samples of our most popular training plans for mountaineering, trail running, climbing, and more. Go to uphillathlete.com/letsgo to sign up for our newsletter, and you will not only get monthly insights on training for uphill athletes, but you'll also get a sample training plan. It's totally free, so why wait? That's uphillathlete.com/LETSGO.